So one of the things I want to do today is just sort of talk through about what observation is, mass observation is, talk through some of the strengths and some of the weaknesses in this particular data source, so that if you're interested in using the source, you've got a better idea of where those strengths and weaknesses are and whether you'd want to engage with it and how you might want to use it. So the thing to say about mass observation is that actually now, in 2016, it's an archive. And it's a specialist collection of qualitative material about everyday life in Britain. And there are two particular collections. So the first is material generated by the original Mass Observation Social Research Organisation, and that was set up in 1937 and ran to the early 1950s. And then there's the newer contemporary collection, which is known as the Mass Observation Project, and that's started in 1981 and has been collecting material continuously since then. So today, I want to talk more about the 1981 collection because that's what I've been doing my research on. But I will talk a little bit about the historical collection so that there's sort of some signposting that you can have to see whether or not you might want to engage with that source. So the first mass observation collection began and was launched in 1937, and the people that launched it wanted to create an anthropology at home, or a science of ourselves. So that was in 1937 that it was launched. In the New Statesman, Joe Moran, talking 70 years or so later, said that what his view is that mass observation wanted to plot weather maps of public feeling to make ordinary citizens' lives and thoughts better known to the people who governed them. So what this group of individuals that set mass observation up in 1937 did was they recruited different people. So they recruited a national panel of volunteer writers, and they set these volunteer writers tasks, asked them to answer questionnaires, and they asked them to write diaries as well. So some of you might be familiar with Nella's diary, which was televised and starred the late and lovely Victoria Wood. They also had recruited teams of paid and unpaid observers. I don't think this would pass a modern ethics committee now, but what they did was eavesdropped and recorded conversations in everyday places like pubs and shops. They interviewed people in the street. They went to Bolton, which they called Worktown, and observed people carrying out everyday activities. They took photographs, made films, wrote reports, wrote books. When the Second World War broke out, the government wanted to find out more about public morale, wanted to work out what people were thinking about the war. The techniques they were using were really ineffective and weren't popular with the public, so they went to mass observation and said, will you help us? And they did. And that was a very effective way of investigating public morale in World War II. After the end of the World War II, it sort of started to peter out. It became more of a market research tool, and it stopped in the early 1950s. A large proportion of the material that was generated ended up at the University of Sussex. So how would you access this? Well, you can access it by going to the University of Sussex and visiting the archive there. You can also access it by going to Adam Matthews' collection. And this is a digital collection, but it's actually by subscription. So I think people can subscribe individually, but before I came here, I asked them where these collections, which academic institutions were subscribing. They weren't able to tell me all of them, but there are 41 institutions that are subscribing. So if you go to your library, you might be able to identify whether your particular institution subscribes. The physical archives are held at the Keep in Brighton. Most of the 1981 material isn't digitised, but that is changing. So, moving on to the 1981 project, This began in the 1980s at the University of Sussex. The contemporary archive consists of the writing of more than 3,500 people, and these are volunteer writers, and they've joined and left at different time points between 1981 and present day. There are people who joined in 1981 who are still writing for the archive. So they represent a sort of an opportunity to actually follow individuals through time. Writers are given anonymised identities. So these are numbers prefixed by a letter. A883 is an example. And they're asked to write this number on their writing. And they're also asked to provide a brief demographic description on all their writing as well. And this demographic description is very small, but it changes over time. The quality of the description can vary. And there are tensions between that particular little source of data and the actual writing itself. So people, using this example, B1898, female, 76, married, but husband resident in nursing home, Hailsham, East Sussex, claims assessor. So when you look at that, you think, okay, she's a claims assessor, but you look at her age, you think, well, she's 76, so she can't be a claims assessor, surely, she must be retired. So what people are saying in their sort of more quantitative demographic data about themselves may not be actually true to who they are at this moment. This person may have been a claims assessor in her last job. She may have been a claims assessor. That may have been her major job. That might be her occupational identity, but it may not be who she is now. Another point possibly is that actually she's talking about her husband, but I don't think she is. This issue also comes out when we use mass observation metadata. So these are biographical data sheets that individuals write about themselves when they join. And the data sheets give descriptions of the actual individual that aren't always, there's a disjuncture between those descriptions and what you see coming out in the writing in terms of their identity. The writers are asked not to name others, and they've all given consent for secondary use of their data. So what do they write? So they write in response to directives. These are sets of themed questions on different topics that are sent out 3 times a year. And there are different things that they do. So they're asked to write about their views. So this could be on issues such as what do you think of the welfare state, what do you think of the NHS, what do you think of the most recent war, topical political events. They also can be asked to describe their lives, so to talk about their experiences such as of paid employment, unemployment, having a pet. And they also can be asked to describe themselves, for example, their perceptions of their class or the perceptions of their health or their sense of belonging to a community. These are just examples of directives that are sent out, some written text that was written in 2008. The directives themselves are thought up by the mass observation staff, but they also can be commissioned by researchers. And as I understand it, there are different rates for, say, for PhD students to people who are getting funding. And these are some examples of directives. On the left, there's some directives from the late 1990s. On the right, some directives from the early 2010s. And you can see there's a very broad range of topics that are covered there. The thing to note about the directive is that this is a research instrument. So this is an example of one. In 2008, people asked about their lifeline, and this is a project that I've been recently working on. And they were asked to draw their lifeline, mark it up with key events in their lives. So we looked at these, and we found that actually not all of the writers on the panel were responding to directives. Not all of them stuck to the suggested format. Some wrote essays, some wrote chronological bullet points. One did a drawing, a painting, which was lovely. And not all writers respond to the questions asked. So we have M2854 who says, I don't want to do this, it's far too depressing. I've had such a miserable and wasted time, I want to write about my tree instead. And then we had F2218, who is more philosophical. He says, I'm sure you don't want a recital of memorable events. Memories fade, become part of a homogeneous mass. If your life is a series of occasions, how do you cope with in-betweens? Which I think is quite a nice little quote. The responses to directives can be very varied. Writers don't have to answer a directive. They can choose to ignore any or all of the questions asked, and they can all ignore directions on format. Having said that, most of them are actually quite compliant and will answer the questions and will stick broadly to the order of the questions that are asked. The other thing to note is it's not the same as reading interview transcripts. So when you're sitting down with a script and reading it, it can feel really frustrating because you've got somebody who doesn't quite stage the question. They'll go off on tangents. And it could just, the initial response that I had when I started reading these was like, oh, goodness sake, stick to the subject. But it's actually really interesting too, because these tangents themselves can generate unexpected insights so that you get that sort of golden nugget moment when you're reading. It's important to be aware of the research instrument, which represents the context in which responses are produced. And another thing I've wondered about is actually perhaps because more than one set of questions are sent out at any particular time is perhaps we should be also reading the associated directives. Does this affect the responses that are given? So responses produce and capture thoughts and views, experiences. Sometimes these can be quite separate, but quite often they'll all come together in one response, so the everyday meets the political. It could be contemporary writing, and it could be retrospective, reflecting back on people's lives, so you get a sense of history of their lives as well. There's a big difference in the responses that were produced between the early 80s and the late 1980s, and I don't know why that is, and that's a question I'd really like to know more about. But potentially it may be something to do with cultural change, I don't know. The format, these are handwritten, typed and word processed. Now in 2016, I've been told that 50% of people word process. So there's access to sort of digital material is increasing. People can write one paragraph or 20 pages, and they don't always write at one sitting, which will affect the response as well. So who are these writers? Well, there's self-selected volunteer writers. In 1981, the people running the project sent out letters to the press appealing for writers, but since then there's been no major campaigns to recruit writers. And the archive receives approximately 200 applications each year from people wanting to join. In 1988, they had 1,000 writers. In 2016, they've got 450, and this is really about the resources of the archive staff. They can't manage 1,000 writers, so they've reduced the panel to 450 writers. The archive itself did some simple analyses of mass observation, and this suggested that there was an overrepresentation of women over the age of 50 from the southeast. And in response to this, they've changed their selection criteria in 2004 to privilege younger men from the northeast. So one of the criticisms amongst social sciences is that writers aren't representative of the broader UK population. And people ask, is Mass Observation Project a trustworthy source of data? So that's an interesting question. And we set out quite recently with an ESRC funded project to find out more about these writers and to enable confident use of mass observation project. And one of the things that the questions we wanted to investigate and to sort of come out with it as an outcome at the end was not are they representative, but who are they? Because knowing and understanding who they are is really important for being able to confidently use the archive. So what we've done is we've created a database using archival metadata, and this has got writers' demographic characteristics and writers' behaviours, writing behaviours, so that we're able to actually provide people with information on who these people that are writing are. And we're also providing some simple tools for comparison with the broader UK population. We've got an event on the 18th of July, but it's going to close, registration will close by tomorrow, so if you do want to join us, book before 12 o'clock. Okay, so I'll just run through some sort of very broad findings that have come out of this project. So the thing to note is that the data was actually, we thought there would be a lot more. We looked at metadata, we looked at biographical data sheets, we looked at other types of data on who these writers are and how they describe themselves. And we found, actually disappointingly, that the data has been only collected at one time point. So this was either in the 1990s when they were given biographical data sheets to fill out, or if they joined after 1990, they filled out biographical data sheets then. So this is all relating to one particular time point, these findings. So gender shouldn't change, so that's 32% of the writers are men, 68% are women. The panel consists of writers aged between 16 to 94, but 75% of the writers were born between 1920 and 1969. The average age at joining is 50. The majority of writers come from England. In terms of their marital status, 50% are married or in civil partnerships, 10% are cohabiting, and 25% have said they're single. But when you actually look at the writing, you find that there's a disjunct between these descriptions of, particularly with men who are saying they're single, and actually when you look at their writing and find out that they're actually in same-sex partnerships. So that's a sort of that's an interesting issue, which probably reflects changes in legislation and cultural change. Only 30% of the writers provided information on their living arrangements. Half of them provided information on their employment status, so 50% were employed. Of these, 50% were employed. Half in the public sector, half in the private sector, 27% was retired. And they gave us a lot of very detailed information on their occupations, which was quite difficult to clean. So what we've done is taken that and provided looked at it from the perspective of the ONS Standard Occupational Classification in 2010 and 1990. And what we found that higher professionals, managers and senior officials are underrepresented. There's a greater representation of professionals, underrepresentation of skilled and non-skilled professions, but actually all those professions are covered. There are a variety of different occupational classes in the archive amongst all the writers, and the database enables people to sample on occupation. I won't, this is going to go onto the website, so I won't go into this slide, which is provided by a colleague, Daiga Camarade, but it's worth a look if you want to go and look at on the website when it's up. So uses of secondary data, of mass observation as a source of secondary data. Well, it's interdisciplinary. It's widely used across the social sciences and humanities. It's also used by arts. Some people from the science use it as well. So there's huge interdisciplinary opportunities. It can be used thematically. Mostly it can be used to look at particular themes at one time point, or it could be used to look at themes cross-sectionally at different time points. The database offers opportunities to sample writers by gender, occupational class, age or year of birth. It offers longitudinal opportunities to sample writers and to follow them through time. Mixed method opportunities, because it can be used with other types of qualitative data and other types of quantitative data. The archive is increasingly becoming digitised. We've transcribed a lot and we've donated that back to the archive. Other researchers are doing the same, and there are options to transcribe if you're commissioning a directive or just looking at particular scripts. So increasingly there's an opportunity to use computer-assisted qualitative analysis. I'm going to finish with this slide, which is just an example of a project that we undertook 2 or 3 years ago, which was looking at volunteering and social and civic engagement. And what we thought was we'd like to use the mass observation data as a source of in-depth, rich qualitative writing, and to use it with survey data. So we decided to follow 40 writers through time, and we selected directives, that's on the left, directives that we thought were particularly relevant to civic engagement and to volunteering. And then we went to the British Household Panel Survey and Understanding Society to look at survey questions asked around volunteering behaviours, informal caring, and we also looked at the British Social Attitude Survey and looked at volunteering questions there, and we were able to match up the time points. That's not, yes. And actually it was a really interesting exercise in mixed methods, but also in finding how much mass observation could contribute to enabling us to understand volunteering, but also to shed some light on the sort of survey questions that are asked and how people answer them. I'll stop there.